Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors and contributors of Strategy Page discuss current events and other military-related topics with a splash of history. I'm your host, Dan Masterson. Joining us today is Jim Dunnigan, editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author, and acknowledged pioneer and innovator in board war games. Also joining us today is Austin Bay, associate editor of Strategy Page, military author, columnist, and retired Colonel, U.S. Army Reserves.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. Jim, we've done reporting on both the U.S. Navy and the Chinese Navy. It seems like the Chinese Navy is growing and the U.S. Navy is shrinking. Is that right?
Yes, but the U.S. still has the largest Navy in the world. The Chinese aren't interested in having the largest Navy in the world. They just want to dominate their patch, as it were. The Chinese actually have three fleets. The Northern Fleet is interested in the Southern Fleet, and each of them has different responsibilities. The Northern Fleet has the biggest problem because they're facing off against South Korea and Japan, which between them have over 300 warships now. The Central Fleet, not much opposition, and they also go to the aid of the Southern Fleet, which is dealing with the South China Sea. That's where the United States has problems, because we are outnumbered there. But the overall problem for the Chinese is they cannot afford the how should I put it, costs of a naval war, because they are dependent on overseas trade. And that depends on at least neutral seas or their control of the seas. They haven't got enough fleet to control the sea lanes they need. And if they can't, dominate the local navies, they basically face economic catastrophe. For example, they rely on overseas sources for microchips. These are essential for all sorts of military and commercial uses. And right now, the largest supplier is Taiwan. So, they really can't go after Taiwan without threatening their own microprocessor supply. Taiwan is acutely aware of that, and they realize the Chinese could say, the heck with it, we'll attack Taiwan, and Taiwan can just blow up their plants, and rather than allow the Chinese to capture them. The Chinese are aware of that, so it's sort of a standoff. So China is basically stalled right now. They basically do have more warships than the United States, but in tonnage, there's still a deficit. The United States has more powerful ships. We have experienced sailors. We have problems, recruiting enough, sailors, especially for the submarines. But the Chinese have even worse problems. They're basically hurtling towards a population crash. Thank the one-child policy that existed for about 3 decades until, quite recently. That has caused a collapse of the military-age manpower available to them. So, China has opportunities, but it's right at the moment it's lacking the capability to take advantage of them.
Austin, your take?
The Chinese are building capabilities. That's the thing. They're also exercising what capabilities they have, and in some cases they're really pushing the envelope politically. Let's say it's politically. They're on the edge militarily. But there's also a political push with it. Xi Jinping has got himself in a bind now, Dan, and it's a bind of his own making. Let's say it's one he wants, or he thinks he wants, or at one time he thought he wanted. That is, he's going to take Taiwan and restore it to the Middle Kingdom, because we're really facing a renewed Han Chinese empire. And again, that's not news. You can see a couple of things that Jim and I worked on in a Quick and Dirty Guide to War series, and then Other things that I've written in opinion columns, that the Han are the world's largest ethnic group, and they dominate China, and it is if you see what she is up to, it's a Han ethnic empire restoration, and that's has to do with some of the reasons they are so prejudiced against and hard on their Tibetan and Uyghur ethnic minorities. They are, and it's dare I say it, Chinese Asian racism in action. But it's a component of what you see in Beijing's policies. You don't get that in very much in media coverage, because that just doesn't compute, since you're dealing with a so-called communist regime. It is a communist regime, but remember, what it is a totalitarian regime. A totalitarian regime that has a committed to retaking, as they say it, or recovering, or invading, and however they do it. All of those have different messages in it, and they all represent different approaches to the historical approaches to the discussion of Taiwan. Another point I want to make before I get to the Navy: the mainland China that we face can't be trusted at all when it signs a document. And in fact, the Sino-British treaty over Hong Kong was just completely ignored. They don't. When they decide they are strong enough to make a move, it makes no difference. China signed, they unclosed the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, and it said it was going to uphold it. And then when the 2016 arbitrators resolution came through that gave the Philippines 98% of their claim against China for stealing territory, fishing, and other sea resources, and the bullying that went on, they completely ignored the arbitration ruling that they had agreed to live by, and are still in the process of trying to muscle the Hague Arbitration Court into backing down. So you've got those political attitudes, and then here we get to the Navy, the physical component of it. They are expanding it. They've got not only a hull advantage. I mean, Jim's got all the facts about displacement, also capabilities. Our Navy ships, our DDGs, especially our TAC subs, are the world's best, and they've got absolutely fabulous electronics, and our weapons are very, very good. Our carriers are very, very good, but the U.S. Navy is a global Navy. And to start off, it's an Atlantic and Pacific Navy to begin with, and the Chinese are set up for what we've called in the past the home game, Western Pacific, and still using the Chinese coast as a air and missile support platform for the Navy. So they're not only building more hulls, they're building more capable ships. They're also building aircraft carriers. Admittedly, they're limited capability compared to the U.S. Navy, but they are building them. And essentially, they've built unsinkable aircraft carriers in the South China Sea, where Jim said we're already behind the eight ball. Well, all those artificial islands, they build them up. They start off saying they're just going to be weather reporting stations, and now they bristle with surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship missiles, and airfields capable of handling high-performance jet aircraft. It's like a bunch of little static aircraft carriers leading right down to Singapore, which is where I think they've been headed for a long time, and it's supported by their propaganda / legal warfare, where they claimed, the 9-dash line, that's traditional Chinese waters, and it's all all that belongs to China, and if you fly over it or sail through it, the Chinese get on the radio and tell you you need their permission, which they don't. You don't. But that's the game they play. And they're building a combined air and sea force to at some point, with the implication that they're going to enforce that. And that's ground for war. China does depend on overseas trade, as Jim said. But look how dictatorships make bad decisions, Dan, especially when they think they've got the power to roll their opposition. Now, again, a counter to it, Jim's already pointed out how strong Japan and South Korea are. Here's another American weakness, but I gotta say our allies kind of pick it up. Really, it starts in the late '80s when we see that the Russians are being defeated in a Cold War. But we start offshoring our commercial shipbuilding. We used to be the world's major commercial shipbuilder. Now it's few, far between, and we've ended up with a problem where we don't have enough work for shipbuilders, for the workers, to be sustained between quote unquote military contracts, and we need to do something about that. I realize that this is a military industrial program, but it has real defense security implications. That said, South Korea and Japan still build a lot of ships, and they're great allies to have. But they're also vulnerable. They're right there by China. They're within medium and in some case short-range ballistic missile range of China. And the U.S. is going to have to do something about that over the long haul, which leads back to some discussions we've had in the past about what are we doing in the short haul, because there's what Admiral Davidson called the window of vulnerability, but it was also something Dr. Andrew Marshall mentioned in the early 90s, that by the mid-2020s, China would be powerful enough that the U.S. might have to confront what Dr. Marshall called a war for national survival. And you certainly see China building military forces towards that goal.
Jim, what are the capabilities that the United States has as far as building ships, especially submarines?
Well, we have enough submarine yards to basically keep our nuclear submarine fleet, constant, to replace the older subs. Austin is quite right about the shortage of the American shipbuilding capability. We basically surrendered that after World War II into the 50s. We were the largest shipbuilder in the world. But as the economies in Europe and Japan and eventually South Korea recovered, they overtook the United States. Now China got in on that, but it was always neck and neck, competing with South Korea and Japan. The current situation is that the Chinese have more warships than the United States. They have about 600. We have, a little, not quite 500. But South Korea, between South Korea and Japan, which have fleets of about equal size, there are over 300 warships. So South Korea and Japan have basically a vested interest in the or the same interest as the United States in not letting the Chinese run amok with a much larger and more powerful fleet. Between the South Korean and Japanese navies and the Pacific Fleet, which we have, over the years, since the Cold War ended, we've moved more of our warships to the Pacific. That was intentional. And it basically gives us a parity with China. China, of course, is not looking for a naval war. As I mentioned before, their problems are economic. And right now, those economic problems are even worse because Xi Jinping is having a problem staying in power because the economy's tanking, partly because of COVID, partly because of China becoming less friendly to offshoring, foreign companies, operating companies, manufacturing facilities in China. A lot of those foreign companies are reshoring, as it were, moving their plants, their manufacturing operations to other Asian countries. I mean, Thailand, even South Korea and Japan. But there's a lot of smaller countries in Southeast Asia which are more than happy to see, more economic activity from these companies. And that's China's loss. And the Chinese are basically suffering from an unemployment problem, a military-age manpower problem. They are not without problems. They can build a lot of ships and they can maintain a lot of ships. But as Austin pointed out, they haven't got the experience, even though they send their ships to sea more often. They haven't got enough military-age personnel to man all the ships they can build. So nobody has a clear advantage. And basically the Western coalition, U.S., South Korea, and Japan, are defensive. We're not looking for a war. It's the Chinese who are trying to be aggressive. They say in the South China Sea, which was sort of a surprise to everybody. China wants to control the South China Sea. Well, that did not go unnoticed, and it cannot go unchallenged because that area is part of a sea routes from East Asia, to the Middle East and in Europe, and the Chinese are facing pushback, resistance. And again, they don't necessarily want to go to war over the South China Sea, but they don't want to give it up either. So they basically stuck their foot in the tar pit, and they can't pull it out. That's their problem. And it's also, the Philippines and the other Southeast Asian countries' problem, because China is now an obstacle, a potential obstacle, even though the Chinese really haven't got the wherewithal to exercise their obstacle, as it were. But it's there, and things can change in a few years in that part of the world.
Austin, what would happen if we had a...
Dan, yeah,
Go ahead.
I want to make a comment on it. Look, it's that China has become the world's problem in the South China Sea. It just talks about what it connects and all the trade that comes out of East Asia, going east and west. Also the flow of resources from Southwest Asia and Africa to East Asia, and going through its route to North America as well, at least the west coast of North America. I'm talking about from Mexico, U.S. and Canada. I mean, it's a funnel. There are two real straits down there, Malacca and what's the other one, Lombok, I think, that you can you go through to connect the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and the most convenient one is Malacca, which gets very narrow right there at Singapore. I've flown over it twice, and you see, if you're looking to the east, you just see nothing but ships heading out till the parallax of these huge freighters lined up to go through that strait. The Chinese have moved in there, and as I said, not only did they build these artificial islands, they turned them into micro fortresses, and they did it at the expense of the Philippines, at the expense of Vietnam, at the expense of Malaysia, actually Brunei as well too, I want to say, but Malaysia, and not quite Thailand yet. Cambodia has become something of a satrap for Beijing, through corruption and the like, but yet they just bullied their small neighbors down there, and the only big boy back up is us, the United States. And it's in our interest because so much trade goes through there. You see the figure 5 trillion. It's probably more like 5.5 trillion to 6 trillion in trade value flows through the South China Sea. It's just huge. Now you were going to ask me a question, Dan. I'm sorry, but it's in our interest to be there, and there's a conflict point. Oh, you asked me what did I think a conflict would look like?
Yeah.
I think here I'm selling, cocktails from hell, but there are 4 or 5 little war scenarios at the end of the China chapter, and I think accidental conflict is of some sort. You hope it's brief, but a short naval war that kicks off over who knows what the trigger is. Some trigger happy or angry. I think it would be Chinese sea militia group that decides to sink a Filipino Coast Guard cutter or the like, and bang, there's a shoot there, and then the U.S. Are we going to back up our bilateral commitment with the Philippines? I mean, there's so much activity in there, and there has been so much aggressive action by China that at some point one of these smaller neighbors pushes back, and then we're in it too. If you can't calm it down, I think that is. I'm not making a prediction. I'm just telling you those are the elements that would lead to a naval conflict, and hopefully one that would be restricted. The big one, of course, is Beijing deciding, all right, we're going for it, despite all the things that Jim said, and they're all very, very on point and erudite about chip manufacturing and how it really, in many ways, they're integrated, a number of integrated interests between Taiwan and China, also Japan and China, South Korea and China. But the Chinese decide, so what? It's just like Hong Kong. They perceive a moment of weakness, a weak American administration, as an example, and decide they're going to do it. Now there you got the possibility of a very violent and large conflict that also has land components. South Korea is saying not just on Taiwan, and that comes from what? Beijing gambling, or that's one way to look at it, or another one, as Jim pointed out, China's got some internal problems, some really big strategic level internal problems, and the dictatorship decides we're in now long-term decline if we're ever going to do it, and what's going on with the long-term decline? So they're having pushback from the Chinese people. And don't think the communists aren't afraid of the Chinese people. They are. Tiananmen Square shows you how they are afraid. They commit a massacre to scare everybody. So you've got a support slippage or increased disruption in the Chinese population. And so we need a war to show we're still in charge and we're for China and we're super Chinese ethno-nationalists. So they decide to go after it. Now you've got a huge fight there that you can't will away. You've got to prepare for it. The best way to stop all of these little scenarios, though, is to be so powerful that the would-be gamblers or the desperados in Beijing are deterred. It's likely that you're going to lose. And I've written a couple of columns recently focus on Senator Roger Wicker's May 3rd speech in the Senate, where he's talking about the USN as a deterrent force to stop a war with China in the Western Pacific. And he's concerned about, and it really is a brilliant speech that pulls together a bunch of things that other people have said, things Jim and I have written, and the like. But I mean, concerned individuals have said really over the last 15 years about U.S. preparedness in the Western Pacific vis-a-vis China. And it's like the way you stop the war is to convince the enemy, the enemy, meaning the Chinese leadership, that you're going to lose. You're not going to succeed. And all of these other issues that Jim pointed out earlier about China's dependence on trade and having to get along with people now, and of course the Chinese population that likes having money and likes having portable computers and likes having little electric cars. It's far better than poverty. All that's going to go away very quickly if they go to a war and don't win it quickly. If they go to this Taiwan invasion scenario, but those are possibilities, and the way you stop it is it's Scipio Africanus, which is, if you want war, prepare for peace. He's the Roman general that beat Hannibal. He knew a little bit about strategic consequences. You just got to be so strong that your opponents, hey, let's talk and instead of fight. And that's also good Sun Tzu too. I'll give the Chinese that. Sun Tzu says, it's too risky to go to combat. You don't know what's going to happen. And he spends all his time talking about, you want this perception, you want to be powerful, and then you really don't want to fight. And wise man, you don't. And that's why, to get back to Senator Wicker on it, he says, let's rebuild this Navy. Let's have, with the global responsibilities that the U.S. has taken on, for ensuring free trade. Free trade, open trade. We're not pirates. We're trying to keep the pirates down. We don't want any pirates. Nobody wants pirates. Doesn't do anybody any good. But essentially, China has been a pirate in the South China Sea, Dan. And when it comes to gobbling up other nations' resources and territory, it's all it. And the world as it exists now, with both the communications, the international trade, these little disruptions actually have an impact. You don't want to overreact, but you have to pay attention when somebody's doing something like that. Anyway, those are some scenarios, but you said there are other things that could act as triggers, but all of those big things that I mentioned would be in play.
Well, we'll leave it there for today, and I'm sure we'll talk about this again in the future. Have a good week, you gentlemen. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Take care.